Freeman. Keep watching.
In a world where the quality of information available to poorer communities is doctored, tainted and sometimes regressive, where the words fake news have come to mean other people's opinions, it is vital to rely on news platforms with journalists who have feet on the ground and can report the truth. New York Parrot, a New York-based national and global news outlet, is changing the narratives of media operations. We focus on the news that matters, like self-empowerment, entrepreneurship, finances, health, security, politics, and more. We strive to curb violence, racial and economic discrimination, and to promote peace and socio-economic development of multiculturally diverse world. As we give voice to the people, we also give your business a voice and make it heard. Get your product and services off the ground by advertising on our fast-growing platform. With so much of daily visits to New York Parrot, you can't afford to be invisible to prospective clients on the website they trust the most. Our posts reach millions of people across the New York State and around the world. Advertising on our news site will unlock an audience of thousands of potential customers on your doorstep. New York Parrot is born to prosperously speak tomorrow for the voiceless.
Hello, welcome to the Foreign Policy Review. I am Dustin Pickering, your host, and today we have Alan Freeman on the show, guests Ben Toth, and Billy Bob and Carlo Parcelli as co-hosts. Thanks for joining us all today. We'll get off to Billy Bob and let him introduce our guest and talk a little bit about how he was brought onto the show. So thanks for joining us all today. Please subscribe to our channel.
Thank you, Dustin. So I first found out about Alan when I watched the Critical Theory workshop. They uploaded a lecture from July onto YouTube just a couple of weeks ago. So that's where I first was introduced to Alan, and he had a great presentation on imperialism. I thought he would be a tremendous guest to have on our program. And then I talked with him some more. I reached out to him, and I found out a lot more about him, some very interesting things. He was actually one of the only North Americans to be invited to the Valdai Discussion Club, I think 2021, or is that the wrong year, Alan?
It was 22. It was at the end of last year, but I wasn't the only one to be invited. We were myself and Radhika were the only ones who came.
Okay, that's important. So your spouse and yourself, Radhika Desai, were invited, and you guys went to the Valdai Discussion Club. You gave a speech, if I'm not mistaken, and you had a little bit of dialogue actually with Vladimir Putin, and then the discussion club invited you to write an article about the topics that we're engaged in. So you actually were able to share that article with us. It's not done yet, but it was very interesting. Pretty broad in its scope, but so many things that you touched on that I would like to get into for today's program. But I don't want to. I'd like you to try and frame it yourself. As far as it was like over 9,000 words, I believe. So it's difficult to just summarize in a few sentences. But thank you for coming on the program. And could you maybe just give your own perspective on what your article was about and why it's so necessary to to have this kind of these ideas to share them with the working class. So
I'll do my best. So over to me.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, first of all, it's very good to meet you guys, and thanks to all of you for for this opportunity to participate in this discussion. And I hope this isn't the last time that we engage. I'm sure it won't be, because I think that there's a process going on in the world now, and in part that's what the article itself addresses, by which there's people are beginning to think, what is really going on in the world? We're being fed so much stuff that just doesn't correspond to our experience that we need to really understand it. And there's probably two origins to the article itself, which is part of a longer discussion. One is the Valdai Discussion Club. I'll just explain what that is. It was originally set up 10 more years ago as a kind of Russian Davos. So their idea was that they would invite, eminent Americans and discuss with them. Well, most eminent Americans, when you invite them to a discussion, present company accepted, do tend to think that their function is to tell other people what to do, which is sort of characteristic of the world we live in, the Western world we live in. And they made the mistake of listening. So they were being lectured on democracy while they were being prepared for color revolutions and all the rest of it. There was a dramatic change when I think the war in Syria started, and the first one that we were invited to was 2015. And in 2015, it was an amazing event, because you had there, they invite leaders of Russia and world leaders. And we saw the Syrian prime minister, I believe it was, the speaker of the Iranian parliament, and Putin in a lineup discussing the decision which Russia had just taken in 2015 to respond to the request of the Syrian government to support it militarily in Syria. So that was probably the beginning of Russia beginning to resume some kind of external military role, as when it was part of the USSR, it had done, but it sort of renounced that. And it renounced it in the belief that the West would reciprocate. And there was a sort of state of shock that lasted from 2015 to the present day, in which they gradually discovered that the West was not going to reciprocate. The West was going to, on the contrary, continue the eastward march, was preparing for what we now can see was going to be an armed assault on Crimea, was shelling the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, where the majority of the people are Russian speaking, continuously, even though they'd signed an agreement not to. So the Russians got fairly pissed off with being lectured about democracy while they were being so badly treated. So when they launched the special military operation, fast forward, they had not invited us for some time. We'd had good relations with them, we'd written articles with them and so on, but because they felt that we were too left-wing, and I'm going to come back to this question of left in quotes in a bit, but they felt, perhaps correctly, for what they were trying to do, that we were too left-wing and we would piss off all the eminent Americans. Well, when it came to 2022, none of the eminent Americans wanted to come. Now, I have to say, Jeffrey Sachs did participate online, remotely, and there was another speaker from North America, but they didn't actually attend. We attended. So this got me thinking, why did Russia so misestimate what the response of the West would be? And that's one part of what this article is about. The second part of it starts with the formation of the International Manifesto Group. And the origin of this is some work that Radhika and I did with many collaborators worldwide to establish what we call the Geopolitical Economy Research Group. And in the middle of last year, somebody asked us, in fact, it was before that, it was before the SMO, so it was in 2021, to get together some ideas and form some proposals about what to do. So we had a long set of discussions, and you'll see these on internationalmanifesto.org. We produced what we called an International Manifesto, which was a consensus of what the people we were talking to thought should be done. And there were two things going on. At that time, the coronavirus was just, really reaching its peak, that the panic was reaching its peak. But the SMO, Special Military Operation, had not started. But it did come up against the issue of imperialism. So there was a long discussion of imperialism, which of course got much more intense when the SMO came along, because most of the Western so-called left took the side of NATO. Because let's face it, there are two sides in this war. There's no, like, neither NATO. I haven't heard any left force saying neither NATO nor Russia. It's like full-on NATO. We want Russia to lose. So we thought, this is the base. There's a complete misunderstanding going on here. Now, I'm not going to go into that. Maybe we can discuss that. But we thought the left has got things very wrong. Why has it got things wrong? And we had an anniversary event not long ago in which I was asked to contribute amongst a panel of people like Sarah Flounders, many representatives of the US and Russian, Chinese, Latin American left. This question, why is the anti-imperialist left in the collective West so small, especially given that it's very big outside the collective West? That is to say, 4/5 of the world takes a very different view from what the left intellectuals think in the West. Why? And I got onto the question then, which is really what this article is about. Why is there no international organization of the left? And there's a historical tradition. The first international, founded in 1864. Marx and Engels were very centrally involved in that. That split. There was a fight between the anarchists and basically the Marxists. But then about 11 years later, the Second International was formed, and that was the basis of the social democratic parties that now occupy, they're still there, they occupy the space of what is called the left, in my opinion, wrongly called the left in the West. That broke up when the First World War broke out, because they all supported their own governments. So they were basically saying, we think it's actually more important to kill the workers of other countries than to turn against the government of our own imperialist country. So the left fragmented totally. Then the Communist International was established. Fast forward, and this was based on very solid anti-imperialism and support for the Soviet Union. Fast forward, 1943, Second World War, the Third International, the Comintern as it was called, was wound up. And it was wound up by the Russians because they built, well, the Soviet leadership, Stalin, but not just Stalin. There was consensus that it should be done. In fact, the American Communist Party was the one that actually put the resolutions to the International saying this should be done. They then said, we're doing this because we want to clear the way to get an agreement, a peaceful world in future with the collective West. So the idea was there would be a sort of three-way division of the world. There would be Russia or the Soviet Union, there would be America, and then with the Churchill's UK. That was the idea. The thing is that what they thought would happen, which is there would be a peaceful period, kind of happened, but because of the military might of the USSR, not because of any pressure from below in the Western countries, not because of the peace movement, frankly. So I argued at the Valdai Club meeting, and I also argued in an anniversary event that we had, that one of the problems we have is that the left is actually very small. In fact, much of the space of apparent opposition to what NATO is doing appears to come from the right. I think most of that is fakery. But if you look at people like Orban, they are genuinely on the basis of the interests of their own nation, opposing in many ways what the EU is trying to do, the European Union is trying to do. So there's a problem. The right wing is the one that the Russians are seeing that's the most visible. But the problem is what they actually need is a proper left, a properly anti-imperialist left, because if you rely on the right wing, first of all, it's completely treacherous. And second, it splits the working class, whereas what you need to do is unite the working class. So I put that to the Valdai Club, and there was a speech that I gave, and there's a paper on the Valdai Club that explains that. And it got a lot of interest. People said, yeah, well, maybe it wasn't such a good idea to wind up the Communist International, just like a lot of people in Russia are asking now, maybe it wasn't such a good idea to wind up the USSR. First time that view has been announced. It's not the view of Putin, for example. I think he may be changing his mind, but up until now, he has not based himself on the record of the USSR and has not sought any notion of restoring it. So that got a lot of interest, and they invited Radhika and I to write a paper on basically the left and the war. And that's what the paper is about. So I've taken already 15 minutes of your time, for which I apologize, but now you have the backstory.
So thanks for that, Alan. One of the things I wanted to discuss was, that the idea of a Western left and why they can be so confused, and what distinguishes the Western left from the leftism that you understand and I understand. You mentioned one of the things was, having a wrong understanding of imperialism. And that was, I think, kind of the topic of your discussion at the critical theory workshop. But do you want to talk about, we can talk about going forward, we can talk about the differences between the Western left and the rest of the left, or the origins of the left. But if anybody else wanted to jump in, I definitely don't want to monopolize the entire discussion. So,
yeah, maybe let's hear. I'd love to hear what other people have to say.
Yeah.
I've already taken 15 minutes of your time, so go ahead.
I think imperialism is going to be a big topic for later. But first, on the left and, traditional left and the new left, also Liberal Party. And I'm glad you mentioned Orban. He is a traditional right-winger here in my country, in Hungary. But here, 30 years ago, we had a hard left with something like 22,000 people elected to over 3,000 councils, all democratically, by election. You can always recall them. We had real workers' democracy. 30 years ago, that was demolished, outlawed. There is no actual classical left party, but what they call the liberals, specifically the Western Wilsonian liberals, I think you mentioned in your paper, that American strand, they call that the liberal left. And everybody is convinced that's them, but they have no revolutionary message. They are absolutely with the EU, with NATO on every question, and they're basically sellouts. So the only viable alternative to that is Orban's nationalism. And I'm wondering if you can expand on the liberal, which is objectively a right-wing agenda, as you see it in Canada or in America, that what most people very confusedly call the left, and I would say no, they've never been.
Yeah, do Dustin or CARLO want to come in at all?
No, I'm gonna beg off. I would like to hear your answer to Ben's question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'll reply to Ben and try and fit in a reply to Billy Bob. I think they're very closely linked. I don't know if you guys have come across a work by Domenico Lo Surdo. He's an Italian writer who recently sadly passed away, and he's written many wonderful books, but one that's been published in English it's called Liberalism, A Counter History. And there's another one which is called, I can't remember the exact name, but it's about Western Marxism. It's a critique of Western Marxism. And that is now being translated by the folks at Peace, Land and Bread. And I hope that's going to come out soon. And I would advise everybody to read Lo Surdo's Liberalism and this book when it comes out. And Lo Surdo is a fantastic historian because he deals with very detailed facts. And he defines liberalism essentially as that strand of thinking that emerged. I don't know if he exactly defines it this way, but I'm going to paraphrase, okay? That strand of thinking that emerged from the French Revolution, in which, if you think of the slogans, they're very interesting: liberté, égalité, fraternité. Then you have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So you don't actually have fraternité in America, which is pretty obvious when you join any Facebook chat with Americans participating. There's no fraternité there. The point that he makes is that what that meant to the rising revolutionary classes in France, who were anti-aristocratic, they were bourgeois classes, was absolute freedom of property. And that is the essence of liberalism. Now, he then shows how that gives rise to what I, in my book, call the moral contradictions of Columbianism. Columbianism is my word for what used to be called Eurocentrism, because you can't keep calling it Eurocentrism when America's involved. it's the NATO, it's the North Atlantic, and also Japan is now involved in that. And colonialism I define as the notion that the New World was founded by the great discoverer and hero figure and father figure, who is a mythical figure, Columbus in 1492. And he founded the greatness of our people, which is the West, the collective West. And we are superior, and we are superior mythologically because we have an origin myth, which is the discovery of the Americas. The interesting thing being he only actually visited mainland America once on his third voyage, and was sadly he visited Panama. Like everybody who visits Panama, he was sorely disappointed with what he found. But most of the time he was spent, basically killing off the Taino population of Bermuda and the West Indies. So the Columbian myth is what surrounds the notion that property is the destiny of humankind. Now, he then points out that this gives you huge moral contradictions. So the first was slavery, because slavery is the property of one human over another. So then what happened was that the liberals saw it perfectly reasonable to own slaves. And they looked at antiquity. They loved talking about antiquity and said, well, there were slaves in Greece, there were slaves in Rome, we're going to have slaves here. And it wasn't until the industrial capitalists started to come up with the ladder and found that wage slavery was actually a more efficient way of exploiting people than actual slavery, that this came under attack. And there was an internal crisis in liberalism, which was abolitionism. Abolition is long, like many of the lies of, you see, the credit is that slavery was abolished. No, it wasn't abolished. It simply took the form of slave breeding, which is what happened in the USA and led up to the Civil War. Okay, so there was no longer transport, but slave population actually grew massively during that whole period. So there was then that contradiction erupted in the American Civil War and gave you the founding of modern America. Now, skip forward, America then decides that it is displacing the imperialist powers of Europe. Its mission, as it sees it, is to get rid of the old monarchic dynastic empires of the Spanish and the French and all these aristocratic monarchic survivals from backwardness. And we're going to give you, what are we going to give you? Modern imperialism. Right? No, we're not going to give you
freedom.
We're not going to give you liberté. We're not going to give you égalité. We're not going to give you fraternité. And you're damn lucky if you can pursue happiness. Well, what we're going to give you is Empire American style. This starts in Cuba. They go into Cuba and they say, we're liberating Cuba from the Spanish. And then the Spanish go and the Cubans say, thank you very much. Would you mind leaving? Well, actually, we're going to stay. Then they do the same with the Philippines, where there's a Philippines liberation movement. And they actually overturn the government established or the movement established and conduct the first imperial American genocide against the Philippine people. There's then a big movement in the US, which is very foundational, the anti-imperialist movement, which I'm not going to go into, but it had some influence. And it was then decided we're going to be an imperialist power. Then Wilson comes along, and Wilson is dealing with the Soviet Union, going around saying, freedom of nations, this is the true freedom, the true democracy. And he constructs a counter-liberal narrative to that, which is liberty, including the modern pursuit of property. So you don't have slavery, but you have corporations, you have Pinkertons, you have America policing the world, and you have the organized exploitation of the people of the world based on the dollar monopoly. That wasn't consolidated until the end of the Second World War. There was then a battle that had to be settled between Britain and America. That was settled after the war with the establishment of Bretton Woods, and you get a dollar economy. Everybody has to trade in dollars. And that's how American radical writes a lot about this. This is how American imperial hegemony was established. So that is actually not called neoliberalism at the time. It's because after the war, there was Chinese Revolution and so on. You had to project yourself as slightly not quite as bad as the neoliberals. So you get this liberalism which says, well, we're for the freedom of nations. we are for, progressive use of tax revenues to benefit working population, but we're going to do it our way. And the way we're going to do it is by persuading the capitalist class of our country to do it. The capitalist class of America says, thank you very much. We're very happy to do redistributional socialism, provided you let us exploit the rest of the world. So you get a labor movement which is constructed around, and in Europe exactly the same thing happens. The labor movement and the socialist parties are constructed around saying we will have a kind of social peace. Workers will be allowed to strike, they'll be allowed to form unions, there will be certain civil rights that you get, and you'll all get a lot of money, because if you compare the money that people earn in the global north, it's like way more than people get in the global south, which I think that people in the left don't understand. So it's like imperialism light, in which you have, peace at home combined with imperialism abroad. That's the deal. That's the Wilsonian deal. Now, the left, in commas, simply projects that as being socialism, in my opinion. It's not socialism. And, what happens is it gets becomes then it gets pilloried. It appears to the Russians that is the left. If you look at yourself sitting in the Russian intelligentsia or the Russian leadership circles, and you see what is being projected as left, you then say, my God, I'd rather have the right.
Even
They're
the
wrong,
Russians.
but that's the way it looks. So, one of the purposes of having the discussion, I wouldn't say it's not I don't hate the idea of intervening in other people's business, but the discussion that they have invited us to contribute to is a discussion that they're having about which includes the discussion, what is the real left? What is the real right? And I think that along with imperialism is like the second key question that we face. You need an anti-imperialist, anti-fascist left. I think the Russians are getting there. I mean, a year of fighting Azov battalion Banderistas is remarkably salutary effect. Being determines consciousness, and who you're being killed by has a bigger effect on consciousness than the money. So I think that there's a very fruitful discussion going on. And in answer, therefore, I think I've kind of answered both your points, that liberalism is the defense of property as the basic principle of freedom, subordinating all other freedoms to the freedom to own property. That gave rise to Wilsonian imperialism, which meant that at home you got relative wealth. That's evaporating now, why we're entering a new stage of history, in return for allowing any barbarism that you like for the 4/5 of the world who live don't live in the collective West. And that's what the British and European and American left, in quotes, thinks is socialism, projects as socialism. And it's a tragedy, and we need a completely different kind of left.
We're going to take a brief break, but we'll be right back right after this with the Foreign Policy Review. Thanks for watching.
Is the break long enough for me to make another coffee?
Yeah, the show. We can do that.
More or
Sure,
less.
go ahead.
More or less.
I mean, when I say
Are you curious about financial literacy? Then take a look at Professor Anthony Rivecchio's new program on Parrot TV. It's called Financial Focus University. This is an excellent program to learn about questions related to your own finances post-COVID, if how you can manage your money, how you can work with your tax situation. And this is an excellent and informative discussion of financial literacy. With Professor Anthony Rivecchio, your financial problems will be solved at Parrot TV with Financial Focus University.
There was a lot of
World Inkers Printing and Publishing. We are the company to achieve your goal. World Inkers Printing and Publishing Company will be there to assist you with everything you need to get your work published and printed. We offer at worldinkers.com publication services, public relations and marketing services, digital and print, advertorial services, conferences and seminars, and digital marketing platforms, and World Inkers Network, a forum for writers to meet and to exchange ideas. Contact us at info.worldinkers@gmail.com. World Inkers Printing and Publishing will meet all your publishing and author needs. Keep inking with World Inkers Printing and Publishing. Welcome back to the Foreign Policy Review, and Alan is taking a brief break with coffee. He'll be right back with us. So let's see, what do you guys think of the history he presented? Let's start with, I guess, Ben, what do you think? Did he answer your question?
Oh, he absolutely answered my question, and it's an exciting history, especially the three internationals. And I'm really glad he did include the fourth, because for us communists, that's treachery. That's the Trotskyite faction, which is a revisionist alternative. But I also wanted to mention, I think just for the viewers, because Alan knows this very well, that when we talk of private property and the liberals being the guardians foremost of private property, we don't mean your flat, your toothbrush, your appliances. That's personal property. We mean the means of production. We mean the offices, factories, the way in which industry and economy works. So I just wanted to make that distinction. And I think we'll be heading on to imperialism soon enough, but I wanted to, let others share their thoughts as well.
Another distinction I think we ought to make is between the general population, say, for example, here in the U.S., and people with genuine power here in the U.S. Because when you're talking about liberalism, I know Dustin and I operate in the world poetry and literature that's so far away from anyone who could imagine the world that Dante was operating in, with the Guelphs and the Ghibellines and the Medicis and that. And a kind of true epic spirit was almost thrust upon you. I mean, you had to be very serious about what you were doing. Whereas the poets we encounter and writers we encounter are almost all pro-Russian, and they're just a bunch of virtue signalers. They have no facts. They don't want to know what the facts are. They will not gain any knowledge. So they fall into this category automatically by their own actions as powerless. They have no power. They have subjugated themselves to the power that has brought on this conflict in this case, and the Iraqi conflict, and Iran-Contra, and the Vietnam War and the Korean War. You can go on and on. So I think that distinction is important. I point out, if you want to get like a 4-minute version, you can just go to Phil Oakes and listen to his song "Love Me, Love Me, Love Me, I'm a Liberal," and you'll probably get the whole gist of what I'm trying to say here. But we probably should make a distinction between the sheep and the shepherds. So I thought I'd throw that in.
I think you said they are pro-Russia, but I think you meant anti-Russia.
I'm sorry. Yeah, anti-Russian.
Yeah. Okay, that's what I thought too.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
Have you read? You're familiar with the poetry of Adrian Mitchell, the Liverpool Beat poet?
No,
he wrote a wonderful poem at the time of the Vietnam War called "Tell Me Lies About Vietnam," and it's just so relevant today. But anyway,
yeah. I would also recommend Country Joe and the Fish, The Fixin' to Die Rag, which influenced so many young people like myself at the time. So, right. But that was the time. Sorry about the era about who they support.
Yeah, they're definitely not pro-Russian. But it's not just liberals, right? So on Facebook and social media, the self-described communists, they're also pro-Ukraine. They're anti-Stalin. They're anti-China. They're anti-Soviet Union. These are the Western communists. So it's not just the liberals that have this misunderstanding, I think, about what the left is, but a lot of self-described Western communists just have a fundamental misunderstanding, and it's so important to to define, the differences and to explain the fundamental basis for an authentic left. But Alan, we appreciate your oratory. If you are interested in continuing, we would love to hear more of your perspective.
I just wanted to say something about Orbán, and I wonder if Ben has come across the group that we work with. Not the only group we work with in Hungary, but around the Karl Polanyi Center, Attila Meleg, Tamás Kraus, and people like that. Because I find there's a very progressive strain in Hungarian politics, which is still there, but it's silenced. And I thought what was interesting about Orbán is he came out of, as I recall, one of the wings of the Communist Party. He was originally a kind of social democrat. And then, like a lot of the right wing, he became preoccupied with staying in power. And that is one of the themes of what I'm writing about, because I think that we got to make a distinction between parties of the people and parties of power. So, for example, essentially, if you look at the leadership of the Labour Party in Britain, which I know best, the only thing they're concerned about is how to win elections. There's nothing else. And it's actually the same with the Conservatives. So you get these guys who get to power and don't know what to do with it. Like, I mean, the Liz Truss affair was astonishing. You elect because the Conservative, the vote of 150,000, some tiny small part of the British population who are like the rabid right wing, elected this lunatic to run their country and nearly collapsed it. Well, the same is true of the social democratic parties. Now, Orbán strikes me as somebody who became very preoccupied with staying in power and turned to the right. That's the impression I get. It may have been there already, but he said, hey, this is the way to get the votes. So it's a vote catching thing. There's a much more I'm not saying that's good, but what I'm saying is the much more dangerous right is the right of the streets. It's the right, of the people like the Truckers' Convoy in Canada, and I think the people who assaulted Capitol Hill. That's my opinion. Is that they are essentially about returning to the racist agenda of classical fascism, and the job that's been assigned to them is the destruction of the working class. That's what fascism is for, and I think people are just beginning to wake up to this. So I wanted to finish on that because I thought the Orbán story is a very interesting one. In the left as well, I think it's very important to make a distinction between parties of power and parties of the people. And that's one of the reasons I went back to the historic documents, the First International, Second International, Third International, and the debates, particularly in the Second International, and said, what are these guys really saying? And they just said, it's very simple. We seek to represent the interests of the working class. That's it. Independent of the state. But the kicker is this. If you say you're going to do something independent of the state and the state gets in your way, you say, okay, we're going to change the state. We're going to change the state. So they were revolutionary parties. Now, revolutionary gets hyped up, and I think this is one of the bad features of the far left, including the communist left in the West, as being ultra-violent. So you get sort of anti-Fa puts itself forward. We're the true revolutionaries because we go out and beat up fascists. Yeah, no, the only reason that revolutions are violent is because of the reaction. If you look at what happened in Peru, you look at what happened with Bolsonaro, this is the reaction that invokes the violence. And the revolutionary violence is always defensive. It's always like, these guys are coming for us and we're not going to let them. But you are intransigent to say, we're not going to let them come for us, which is why I support the SMO, because they were coming for us. They were coming. There was going to be a mass genocide of 43% of the population of Ukraine that speaks Russian. And they're racialized. They're racialized. They are, excuse the phrase, but I'm going to say it because it will shock people. They're the niggers of Ukraine. They're the niggers of Ukraine, right? And the Western left says we're against the niggers too. I'm sorry to say, to be so brutal, but that's the way it is. And you've got to get out of that mentality. Now, when you come to the communist parties, I think the thing is a bit more nuanced. There are debates. There's big debates going on. And the communists in Russia are very interesting because there are actually, at last count, 4 communist parties in Russia, not just one. There's, by the way, three communist parties in Belarus, which a lot of people forget. And 2 of them did not support the Color Revolution. Not just the official Communist Party, but the left Communist Party. Now, the left Communist parties in Russia are actually far more militant than Putin. Putin is not driving this thing. It's the Russian population that's driving it. The sentiment, you fuckers, you've come through us the 3rd time in history to come and destroy our people. We're not taking it. That's the general sentiment. Now, the Communist Party in Russia expresses that, but it has what I would consider to be, well, there's a debate. There's a debate, and people say it's too parliamentary, it doesn't do anything. I don't know enough to know that, but I do know that there are other communist parties who have linked up with communist parties the world over. So the United Communist Party put together a coalition which actually includes the PSUV of Venezuela, about 50 communist parties, right? The people we spoke to in Russia, they're very concerned, very active, involved with the militias, involved with the left in the Ukraine army, which exists, right? And yeah, there's a class war going. Basically, there's a class war going on in Ukraine. The people being sent to the front to die, the people they want to get rid of. Remember that, right? They're expendable, and also it's desirable to expend them. So there's a lot of connection there. They have very good connection with communists. So I think within the communist movement itself, there are debates. The British Communist Party, for example, the Morning Star, is generally a pretty good forum for, anti-war material, but is hedging its bets by calling the SNO an invasion, which I don't agree with. It's not an invasion, it was a preemptive defensive response. That's my view. Nobody will probably allow me on television again after saying this, but
well, the CPGBML, the Brass Party, they don't. They are 100% anti-imperialist and with Russia. I know there's
exactly right. So you have, on the one hand, left communist parties, and on the other hand, within the communist parties, so the Morning Star tends to hedge its bets. But they had a guy, and I wish I could remember his name. He spoke on one of our manifesto group panels, and he had been to Ukraine, he'd been to Donetsk, and he came back and he said everything I'm saying. This is a racist, imperialist, fascist war. So, and he's not being thrown out for that, right? He has a view. His view is entertained. So I think that amongst the communist parties of the world, there's simply a discussion going on in which I think one should participate. But then you have to ask, and this brings me back to the question of the left international, what is the forum for such a discussion? The discussions are taking place in the prison of the nation. That's what's happening. So you need to have international forums for that discussion. So the left of the West can learn from the West of the global South, and from the left of the global South, and the left in Russia and the left in China, which is what Radhika and I spend a lot of our time working with, is left forces in the global South. So why is it not happening? Well, I think it's because the Communist International was wound up. You destroyed the main instrument the working class needs in order to act as a force to counter capital, which is an international organization that seeks to represent its interests. So that's where all that leads me, and that's why I've gone back to these historic documents of the internationals. My answer to Bob would be that the reason you have this hesitation or confusion amongst the Western communist parties is precisely because of the dissolution of the Communist International. So there's no forum where they meet together and discuss things.
Well, when in your paper, it seemed to me that imperialism was the pivot, and obviously, a lot of countries that could be involved in that pivot are not communist or have very weak communist backgrounds. But still, I would argue that if you rally them around this kind of European United States hegemony, which is essentially U.S. hegemony, which has ruled the world since Bretton Woods in World War II, that they would be happy to do it. There's already tremendous, BRICS and so on and so forth wanting to expand. Could you elaborate on how large do you see how do you see the anti-imperialist element as a not necessarily in a not necessarily communist framework, and how far would the communist framework need to be within that, if that makes any sense?
It makes total sense, and that's the kind of thing that I'm trying to address in this, or Radhika and I are trying to address in this document. So a debate around those questions, will not end with this program. One of the things that I think is going on is there's a huge sea change going on in politics, and I think you will start to see, maybe this is pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. I always get it the wrong way around. I do optimism of the intellect, pessimism of the will. So if we take the optimism of the will, it seems to me that there's always a point in every war when guys realize, and I use guys, I don't know if it's wrong or right, as gender free. Maybe I shouldn't do that. I'm going to have to turn this. Somebody's trying to phone me and I can't speak to him. What's happening is he's destroyed my train of thought. These guys are going to realize that they're being fooled. And I was asked in one session, I went, what's the best way to build the left in the West? And I said, lose a war. Lose a war. The revolutionary phases of Western countries always appear when people realize they've been fooled into a war which has killed millions of working people, because soldiers are all, By the way, I would say, I would extend the notion of working class to include propertyless, which is what it really meant. Working class in the sense of Marx, of people who have nothing to sell but their labor power.
But their labor, yeah.
And one of the things that the Western left does is collapses that into organized labor, which I don't, and that's not the original sense of working class. Okay, so Portugal is a very classic example, and also the German Revolution. There was a period after the war when Germany actually was run by a Soviet republic led by a trade union leader who wrote the classic history of the German Revolution, which everybody should read. Richard Müller. Portugal was also very interesting because they've been running this unwinnable war against Mozambique and Angola and sending more and more people, and they were getting defeated. And the generals themselves became the damn left wing. And the soldiery came back, and there was the thing they call the Carnation Revolution, when the soldiers stuck carnations in their rifles, overturned the fascist government of Salazar. And there was a tremendously radical period in at one stage, 2/3 of the factories in Portugal were under occupation, under workers' control. They were trying to produce stuff and get an alternative economy going. It was put down. But the point is that the defeat, the realization that you are being fooled, is what unleashed a tremendous transformation of consciousness. So I'm also somewhat against the classic, excuse me for saying this, sort of West Coast school of agitation, which is that you basically have to go out and tell people how to think. And I'm a little bit worried about the shepherd sheep analogy. I think that, no, the thing is not to be able to tell people. They will work it out for themselves. What you have to do is create forums within which, in order to work it out themselves, they can discuss and decide what to do for them.
No. They've already, look, we've already had 2 Iraq wars. They didn't learn a goddamn thing from that.
Because they weren't suffering.
We had the same people that claim to have been out in the street for the second Iraq war. They're now all pro-Ukrainian.
Well, if they don't learn, there's nothing we can do.
Yeah, there's no. Americans can't learn anything. Which brings me to one. We don't have much time, but But
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right when you say, for example, that the Bolsonaro party should not be um, uh, um, a participant in any kind of coalition we're talking about. Or, and I would go by extension, you also mean that the American Tea Party and the MAGA Party, they should not be participants because they're fundamentally they're racist. They're racist parties. Just want to say I agree with you totally on that. And would you like to elaborate a little on that?
It's actually, there's another book that I recommend everybody to read, but it's only in German and we're trying to get it translated. This is Clara Zetkin's History of the Working Class Women's Movement. And Clara Zetkin was a formidable left leader, actually just as influential and important as Luxemburg, who was sort of rightly fated, but people tend to forget Zetkin. And she points out that the Marx tendency within the First International had its origin in the Saxon Spinners and Weavers Association. Now, what's the importance of that? The Saxon Spinners and Weavers Association, men and women were both workers. So they, from the get-go, framed their rules in terms of the absolute equality of men and women, and they were completely explicit about that. Whereas as organized labor got underway, what capitalism tend to do is say, let's restore Victorian, pre-Victorian family relations. Let's turn the family into an institution for managing property. Let's turn the family into an institution for managing the reproduction of workers, because we're not going to do it. We're not, they have to go and do it themselves. So the women have to go back into the home. And so part of the evolution of modern industrial capitalism is actually the re-subjugation of women. This is what Zetkin says. So, don't quote Alan Freeman is saying this and he's a bullshitter and he's wrong. If you think it's wrong, it's Zetkin you've got to argue with. And she says that the left wing of the First International, which was not formed by Marx, it was formed by the British Working Men's Association, SIC in brackets, right? They were the left wing and they were the equality faction. They were the democracy faction within the First International. So the basis on which he works is very simple. You have, if you want to unite the working class, you have to unite the whole working class. The minute you start dividing it and say, okay, women are not equal to men in this, the men must take the lead. We are all men in this panel, but anyway, think about
we
that.
never use that equality argument. We use emancipation of the worker, emancipation of the woman. Basically, that's the
okay. Equal rights. Yeah. I mean, the classic Marxist position, I can't quote chapter and verse, is that I think it's Zetkin. The equality of women is the combination of equality, formal equality of rights, and full participation in the workforce. Wrong or right? I'm just quoting it. Okay. The same with Black Lives Matter. I mean, I get so much stuff on anywhere you go of sort of anti-woke, and there's what they're pointing out is that virtue signaling becomes a substitute for true emancipation. But the answer to that is not to say, no, it's bullshit, gays shouldn't have any rights, all this stuff about abortion is nonsense. Black people should get back where they belong. No, the answer is to say we stand behind the people who rioted when George Floyd was killed. That's where we stand. We stand behind, Stonewall. We stand behind people who are fighting for women's rights. The poor women who are fighting for women's rights, which are completely ignored by the Democrats. So that I think the tradition is when you get I'll finish on this. When you're getting into a process in history, when there's I do believe there will be a mass radicalization as people realize they're being crapped on, and that the austerity that they're seeing is actually something to do with the war, and maybe they shouldn't be supporting the war because it's hurting. That's what's happening in Europe. I think one of the reasons it's not happening in America is people are not hurting yet. Scott Ritter has something to say about this. But anyway, in Europe, they're hurting, and you are getting demonstrations that link austerity and the war. When that happens, you have to go back and read the classics. You have to go back and look at your history. If you look at what happened in the period in the run-up to the Russian Revolution, this was the period of most intense historical reflection. So I'm trying to go back to the historic documents of the working class movement and say, what did they actually say? And they don't actually say what the left now portrays as socialism. They say something completely and utterly different. And if I do nothing else but persuade people to go back and read this stuff, I'll have achieved something. I mean, just one point I've just discovered. Everybody knows that Marx wrote at the end of the Communist Manifesto, "Workers of all lands unite," right? They read that as workers ... unite. That's how they read it. But the "of all lands" is just as important as the workers. And Marx intervened, if you read his address at the founding meeting of the First International, on the precise question of the treatment of nationalities. So anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, as it was then, was in there from the get-go. And you've got to go back and read this stuff, and then you'll see it. It's obvious once you read the historical stuff. Sorry, I ran on a bit there.
It's all good. I mean,
quite all right, and really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah.
Does anybody have anything else to say in the 2 or 3 minutes?
2 or 3 minutes. Can I get a lightning answer? Because not everybody in the audience knows what imperialism is, and many people would say Russia is dreaming of restoring the Soviet Union. It's an inter-imperialist war. Turkey wants the Ottoman Empire back, and China is enslaving Africa. What do you say to them?
Very simple. They can want to be imperialists as much as they want, but the imperialists are not going to let them. And that's the horrible discovery that the Russian elites have made, because imperialism is a select club. Imperialism is not a hierarchy, which is like some of these left communists
monopoly.
I've seen. It's two parts of the world: the global north, which has been the same bunch of people since 1907. The only new addition to the club of imperialists is South Korea, and they had to let them in or they'd have gone communist, right? You know, in fact, the only reason they let Japan and Germany become imperialist powers is if they hadn't, they would have become communist. They're not going to let anybody else in. Turkey's been banging at Europe's doors since ever I can remember. You know, I used to live in Turkey. I've seen these guys at the doors of the Europeans, and the Europeans, yeah, come back later. So the Russians have finally realized that you're not going to get anything from the imperialists because they're 20 times richer than the rest of the world. And imperialism is the division of the world into two halves, the haves and the have-nots, which is what you get in the documents of the Third International. It's not a hierarchy. There are many people who want to become imperialists. They're not going to be allowed. And that's why everybody like, you know, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, very unexpected forces are opposing Russian sanctions and joining the BRICS and so on, because they're saying we're fed up. We're not getting anything out of being, you know, wannabe imperialists. It's not working. Let's try something else. And the something else is the Putin notion of the multipolar world. And that was the answer I got from Putin. I said, we had Christopher Freeland as our leader. What should we do? And he said, well, you have to defend the national interests of your country. That was his answer, going back to the very first question of Billy Bob. Well, you know, I agree with that. The national interests of Canada lie with becoming socialist and aligning with Russia. But, you know, I would rather wait for the second coming of Christ and expect that to happen organically. You have to do something about it. And what you have to do is organize internationally.
Well, thanks for joining us today, Alan, and thanks for CARLO and Billy Bob's and Ben's co-hosting. You've been watching the Foreign Policy Review, and I'm Dustin Pickering. Please subscribe to our channel and check out Parrot TV's other nice programming. And have an excellent day, and do some reading and research of your own, and get some of these books that we've been talking about. Pick them up. Take a look at Scott Ritter's book. We'll have another program again sometime soon, I'm sure. Thanks for joining us all. Have a good day. Subscribe to our channel.
Thank you so much. It's been fantastic, and the dog thinks so.
We just scratched the surface. We just scratched the surface.
We'll have you on again sometime.
Yeah, we better
Thank you so much.